You are listening to Salty Believer Unscripted.
This is Salty Believer Unscripted. I'm Josiah Walker.
I'm Bryan Catherman.
And today we're continuing our series through the landmines of systematic theology. And today we're going to be covering what is man, or mankind and humans. And we're going to be covering the topic of sin. And I don't know if we should do these kind of together or...
Landmines, huh? In humanity, let's see, or sin. No landmines there at all.
No.
I'm going to suggest we probably handle them separately, or at least try to. I think what's going to happen is these are intertangled.
Sure.
And so we're probably not going to be able to detangle them too much, but let's at least take them a category at a time.
Start with man?
Yeah, let's do that one.
Okay. What is man? God is mindful of him.
Okay, we're talking landmines, right?
Sure. So...
Well, you're in seminary. What are the biggest debates that you run into in seminary about this? I know when I was in seminary, there was one that never went away, and I just got so tired of it all the time. Every seminary student on the planet always wanted to talk about this. Do you have this going on? You know what I'm talking about?
I don't think so. Maybe I'm in a different class. But...
Maybe. So it was always about Calvinism.
Okay.
Everybody wanted to talk about Calvinism, and then in this case, so for this particular area of study in our theology, I think it comes down to total depravity.
Sure.
Which is debated, which is a landmine. Right? And I think the idea is it's not... So some people take that to mean there's not anything of any value or any good that we can do at all. And they'd say, there's nothing good you can do without apart from God and all this. And so man is completely as evil as he possibly can be.
Okay.
Now, I don't hold to the position that man is as evil as he possibly can be.
Sure.
I think God is actually keeping all of humanity from being as evil as it possibly can be, even if we're not his people and saved. But I would say that total depravity is we lack the ability to save ourselves in any way.
Okay.
So being totally depraved...
Not that we don't ever do anything good.
Right. Or that we are all continually evil at at the highest level of evil.
Right.
Right. I think if God were to pull back his protection of his creation on that level, we would be as evil as we possibly could be. But he doesn't do that.
Which makes sense, because I believe that we don't do anything good apart from God, right? But
good in God's economy of good, right? Yeah.
But I mean, I have unbelieving friends who do nice things, are good to their neighbor, help old ladies cross the street, right?
So I think the answer to that is, do they do the same things we see Christians do? And sometimes the answer is yes.
Yeah.
They're charitable. Well, where does that come from? But the issue here is dead.
Right.
Right? And dead people don't just suddenly resuscitate. They don't limp along until they find some healing.
Right.
They don't, we're not flailing around drowning. We're totally dead.
Right.
So the total depravity is we're totally dead, not half dead like in The Princess Bride. And you put some bellows in your lungs and then you can still talk a little bit. Like totally dead is the idea. Now that's a really controversial concept for people.
Right.
We can't save ourselves. There's nothing we can do. Obviously, that's going to be a huge
And we're going to
debate.
get into some of those as we go along, as we start talking about election and atonement and stuff like that. But for the purpose of this, are there landmines in maybe why man was even created in the first place?
That would be, yes. Well, especially if you get out. So we're talking about landmines within the theology.
Right.
But most of these landmines that I'm thinking of, I'd have to think a little more, but most of them are actually either between Christianity and false religions claiming to be Christianity, like Mormonism comes to mind, which I'll come back to that, or how we define ourselves in gender and creation and identity and on and on.
Right.
So I think most of those, so I'm trying to think of the landmines within the church. I'm trying to hold, that's a little trickier, and a lot of these things that we're talking about have bled into the church. So
that's a good point.
So Mormons will identify themselves as Christians, although I would contend the Bible says otherwise.
Right.
But Mormons would say that there was a pre-existence, and the reason that man was created was so all those angels, which we talked about that in another one, or all those pre-existent spirits could get a body.
Sure.
So the reason for the creation of man was so that they could all get bodies, go through the whole rigmarole, do all the stuff, eventually be their own gods or whatever.
Right.
So that would be the purpose there. But I would say, if you hold to most orthodox beliefs of the creation of man, it was to glorify God.
Correct.
To honor God. Some would hold that God was lonely, which is not the case according to the Bible, and he needed to create a friend for himself or something.
Well, and you talk about Mormonism and some of the the false dichotomies as far as mankind. But that even has crept into Orthodox Christianity too, because I know Christians, so-called Christians, air quotes, who believe that we're little gods, right? Because we were created in God's image.
Oh, so therefore we have all the aspects
Right.
of God instead of just the communicable attributes.
Yeah.
So we are the image bearers of God, but that doesn't mean we're everything
Right.
God.
Sure.
Right?
We're
God is
100%
shared.
God.
We don't have more than what God has, other than sin.
But we don't have equal to
But
what
we
God
don't have
has.
equal to what God has, right? Yeah. So I think
That
there's
can be a little landmine.
and that can be tricky because if you come up in what maybe like some Pentecostal circles,
Sure.
there's a lot more about God, like you were just talking about. Well, we're little gods in some way. Where you come in with other circles, then you say, well, no, we only have these attributes, and we're holy and entirely different in these ways from God. Which the image bearer issue is one.
Right.
Right. What does that mean that we're image bearers of God?
Sure.
Right? Some people say, well, that means God has this gender or that gender, which that's a whole nother gender argument,
Yeah.
whatever.
You could do a whole podcast on that.
Some people will say we are the very incarnation of Christ in us. The incarnate Christ lives in us, so therefore he can only go where we go, which is really a landminey issue, like he's not all powerful and omnipresent then in that way. And part of it is because we get confused between his humanity and his deity.
Right.
Which there's another landmine, I guess,
Sure.
that how the hypostatic union works. Was he fully God, fully man? The church has dealt with so many heresies along the way.
Some Orthodox Christians would say he laid his divinity aside, and everything he did, we did as a man, so we can too.
Right, everything
right?
he did, we can do exactly the same way. Yeah, there's that kind of argument. Or he has no divinity,
Right.
and we get to be gods like he became a god.
Sure.
That'd be kind of the Mormon view, like we're just like him. But anyway, so I think there's another thing coming, which we haven't experienced much, but I think it's worth some thought. And that is the idea that we are embodied, fully human image bearers of God, but we're starting to function in realms where we're disembodied,
Sure.
and the holistic nature of who we are has disappeared. So you can give yourself a different avatar or icon on the internet. You communicate apart from anybody actually looking at you as a person, knowing your actual name. And we're doing more and more and more of this, which is what I think is causing us not to think very much about the holistic whole person.
Right, or even see them as a person.
Or
I
even-
remember in the 90s having like an AOL screen name, or like a nickname or a handle, right? And I think now we just kind of hide behind those computers and that monitor screen, so we'll just maybe say things we wouldn't necessarily say face-to-face with someone.
Right. We've dehumanized some of
Yeah,
that. So
exactly.
there's sort of that, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see that play out more and more as society goes on, as this VR world goes on, as the tech continues to grow. I think the fact that we've become disembodied people instead of people made in God's image, I think that would be a big that'll be an interesting potential for landmines in the church on how we do that.
Yeah. No, that would be difficult. And it's hard, too, because, like you said, we are created in God's image, right? It's a skewed image or a broken image because of sin.
That is
right?
a landmine as well for some
Sure.
people. Is it Genesis 5:3 that we're made in Adam's image,
Right.
that was originally made in God's image that was
Correct.
tarnished? Or are we actually made in God's image and we don't have an original... We don't have sin carried with us, right? Which we're going to that in soteriology.
Sure, but
too.
I mean, at that point, though, I would argue if we were created in God's image in some manner or fashion, then we should be more valuable or more important than animals.
Oh, that's a super good one.
But I feel like we give a lot more weight to animals, right? Like I'm reading in seminary right now about ethics and abortion, and isn't it like a bald eagle egg? If you even touch that egg, like you
Right.
don't go to jail forever. But
Yeah.
humans'
sea turtle
lives,
eggs are
we don't-
valued upon all
Right.
things.
we
but-
put more value to animal life than we do human life.
Human life doesn't have value in some people's eyes until it's an air breather, but a turtle inside a shell, totally undeveloped or underdeveloped, has finds and value, and
Right.
and then that's a really big deal. When do we have that value as a human?
Sure.
At
And that's a whole
conception,
landmine in itself.
somewhere along the way, something goes from now we were just embryonic to now something. Right. Is it a heartbeat? When does
When it
life
gets
happen?
implanted,
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the really interesting thing is, when does life happen? When it has the potential to be life?
Right. But even that, you argue, because at 24 weeks or whatever, you have the potential outside of the womb. But even then, you're hooked up to false artificial equipment.
Even sperm and an egg have potential
Sure.
to be a human. Or is it the heartbeat, but yet something was happening before that? Here's what's interesting, though. If we find living cells of any kind, or the evidence of even one single-cell organism in some way on Mars, we'll identify that as life on Mars.
Sure.
But if you found one single living cell that wasn't of the exact same DNA of mom,
Right.
but instead was of its own DNA with mom and dad, that's not life.
Right.
These are the debated, challenging difficulties of what is man, what is life, and we haven't even got into all the gender identification.
Sure. Yeah.
And how are we created to be? I mean, those things are playing out in really difficult and unique ways within the church. Some churches are saying, wait a second, gender is a part of your created being and person and who you are, that God gave you gender, which is a pretty good argument, or not, and then you can choose and this, that, and the other thing. And so churches are having to walk through, how do we believe
And some are
what the
saying,
Bible
well, God
says?
messed up and gave me the wrong gender.
Yeah, exactly.
So
some churches go, yep,
or I don't
that's
have a
right,
gender,
but you have
or-
every freedom. And other churches are saying no. And so these are the debates. These are the debates that really, that particular debate probably didn't used to be much in the Orthodox Church, but it's starting to find its way in.
Right.
The value of animals over humanity is starting to find its way into the Christian beliefs.
Well, I feel like all these types of landmines started out as little things, right? Like when I was a kid, I remember it was just the homosexuality issue. Like, was that okay or not okay? And then it just feels like these type of things snowball, right?
Yeah.
So...
Well, and so now the landmines are not even the things that we were tiptoeing around
Sure.
aren't even discussed, and now the other
Right.
things are these big tiptoed issues.
Correct.
That's really, really, really tough.
Yeah.
Really tough. And so I would say that really all of these things sort of play out in the theological area of what is man?
Yeah.
What does the Bible, what does God's Word say is man?
Mm-hmm.
And are we going to submit to that or define it ourselves?
Yeah. That's a good
Right.
point. Who defines that? God, us, the
And
Bible?
I think that's the issue:
What?
is are we self-defining,
Right.
or does God define who we are? Right? These are the landmines. That's what the topic is. Right?
Yeah,
we're not
we're
necessarily dealing with all the issues.
Nope.
We're just letting you know where all the landmines are.
Which I think a lot of us already kind of know those are there. What about with sin, though? Can we shift gears a little bit?
Landmines with okay. Yes, let's go to that.
I
But
feel like we hit them all on man, but now as we kind of look at sin and what is not sin,
okay,
what
so
are some landmines in that area?
last month, Table Talk Magazine's devotional magazine, Ligonier Ministry, did a thing on like the, what do they call it? The overlooked, the ignored.
The ignored sins or
The
something.
ignored sins, yeah.
That
And I
was
read
good.
through those. It was
Yeah.
really good because a
Yeah.
lot of things. So they were saying, look, this is a sin.
Right.
This is a
Kind
sin.
of those little
There's-
little white lies and little,
There's a command here. One of them I thought was really interesting was false guilt.
Ooh.
Like when you're saying something is a sin, you're over the top apologizing for it when actually maybe it's not even a sin in itself, but you're kind of beating yourself up for it. Laziness, gluttony, gossip, just a lot of divorce. Like, let's look at how this all works out. And so there's one angle that anything we do that's commanded we're not supposed to do, or anything we don't do that we're commanded to do, anywhere in the Bible is a sin. And then people get really like, well, what about the shellfish thing? And what about this in the Old Testament? How do the covenants fit together? So there's sort of those debates.
Well, I think that comes with some of the man stuff too. Of people feel like as Christians we call it certain sins, but not other sins.
Right.
Right. And there were these Old Testament things you can't do, but now we say in the New Testament you can do.
So we have to figure out how the Bible communicates those. There are some people that will hold to any imperative command. If you're not sharing the gospel, you're not doing evangelism, you're in sin.
Right.
If you're not attending church services and you've forsaken the body, you're in sin. And I think there's some truth to a lot of that. You're not doing what you've been told to do.
Right.
But then there's the other side of it. Some people will say, well, only those things that violate the Ten Commandments.
Okay.
Now, what's fascinating to me is how Jesus shows us how broad that really is.
Mm-hmm.
You have read, do not murder.
Right.
But if you hate your brother, you're committing murder. Like, it's kind of hard to split hairs in there. So there's landmines. And Jesus was dealing with landmines then.
Right.
Talking about what is sin, what isn't sin. They were splitting hairs back
Absolutely,
then. And
right.
trying to figure, I'm good, I'm off the hook.
How do I get eternal life? I'm good. I did all these things, Jesus. Right.
Yep. Hey,
Check all the boxes.
I've kept up all the law. So I think I think the landmines play out in how we try to define it. Oh, here's one. Sorry, I wasn't.
Oh, you're good.
This one's a fun one. People will say, well, all sins will cause you to be cast out from heaven, so all sins are the same.
Right.
But the Bible doesn't treat it that way. Some sins are so heinous that you had to be stoned to death. Other sins, you had to do this particular act in the Old Testament, or you were considered unclean during your menstrual cycle. Well, that's not stone the person to death. This sin, that sin. You know what I'm saying?
It's true though, and I had that kind of discussion with somebody this week of, all sin has the same weight in God's eyes, and we put the weights on there, and we say these are worse and these are better. I didn't think about the fact that the Bible kind of does that too a little bit.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, though, the irony is, why do people say that? What they're usually trying to do is get out from a big sin by saying, my reckless driving, drunk driving for the 6th time, killing someone for the 4th time is not any different than your white lie.
Right.
Well,
or we're trying to make ourselves feel better, right? Hey, I just stole a Snickers bar. It's not like I'm a murderer, right?
Yeah.
So I cheated on my taxes a little bit.
It goes both ways. But the reality is there is a varying degree of magnitude that we can see. Even Paul says, hey, there's a person in the church who's, sleeping with his mom or stepmom or that situation. You need to deal with it this way. But he's not calling every other little thing. Another point, he says, hey, when you come together for the Lord's Supper, some of you are eating and getting drunk, and some of you were not able to eat. And he's not saying at that point, put everybody out of the church. But he told the person sleeping with his mom, put him out of the church.
Sure.
So there is a landmines here in how we read the Bible and how we understand the varying degrees of sin.
Well, and how we view it too, right? And how we confront it in the lives of other believers. I mean, I recently met somebody who came from a pretty strict, pretty orthodox church in a different country, and they had a certain bench and a certain spot in the church that if you had sinned that week, you had to sit on that bench. And I'm trying to think, how do you fit the whole church on that one bench?
Because some people literally will view sin as like only the big majors, and let's just not worry about everything else. Right. And other people will go, everything about what I'm sinful constantly.
Yeah.
And so landmines there, right? Just a lot of debate and complexity in this field, in that area. By the way, this is just your 50-cent word for your next cocktail party, the study of sin, or the theology of sin, is called harmatology.
Okay, harmatology. I didn't know that, and I'm in seminary, so here we go.
Easy way to remember sin is it does you harm.
Okay,
right? Harmatology.
So now let's talk about a major landmine, just as we're kind of wrapping up. Did God create sin? This is one my wife and I struggle with.
Okay, so
she's got kind of mad at me before.
This is hard because, first of all, God, as soon as we say, well, nothing, everything that was ever created, but sin is a description of something.
Right.
It's not an actual something. I can't have an actual handful of sin, a bucket of sin. It's a description. Just like evil is a description of something, just like purple is a description of something. So the challenge here is a lot of times we struggle with the description, and the description is against God, violation of God.
Right.
So on that front, can God be against himself?
I'm going to say no.
Can he violate himself? Right. I mean, in the way that he sinned against himself. If the definition in and of itself is against God,
right?
Is
it kind of like darkness is the absence of light?
Yeah, it's sort of that weird conversation that way, right? So here's the problem, though. Did he create the ability for us to sin? Yes, he did.
Sure.
Did he force us to sin? No, he did not. Again, major landmines in the conversation.
And that comes back to Adam and Eve, too, and the what is man thing, right? Did they have different parameters than we do?
Right.
When we're born into sin?
Yeah, well, so we have a depraved sin nature, and they didn't, so they were truly neutral.
Sure.
And in being truly neutral, or having a free will instead of a depraved will, they possessed the capability to sin against God. Did God create that capability? Yes. Did he create the sin act?
Yeah.
No. So that's because sin is an action, or sin is an act, not a thing.
Right.
Right? And so our sin nature is a proclivity to act in a certain way. So I'm not trying to answer the question, but these are where the landmines come in, because wait a minute, what about this, and how about that? And was it, so here's what's interesting. I remember having a discussion with a pastor years ago. could Jesus have sinned? And the argument was like, no way. There was no way possible he could sin because he's fully God and God can't sin.
Right.
But he's also fully human.
So
right?
there's a 50% chance?
Well, he's not 50%, 50%.
Right. So
He's
there's
100%,
chance?
100%. He's 200%, right? So together, the hypostatic union, mind-blowing. But so these conversations are really, really complex.
Yeah.
Could Jesus have actually been tempted in his humanity by Satan? I have to say yes, or the perfect life was pointless. But could he have actually been tempted by Satan as God? I have to say no, because he can't go against his divinity. So these things are complicated. It's where the landmines are.
Right.
It's where you step on it, it blows up. Also, just for the record, because I was having a conversation, I think with my son about landmines. You can't step on a landmine and then go, oh no, I've stepped on a landmine. You push the button down, and then have somebody come along and defuse it and settle it, because landmines don't work that way. So if you're thinking in theology, landmines work that way, where, oh, I've stepped on one, now I need to deal with it. That's not true. That's just movie farce. The landmine blows up when you depress the button, when you push that thing down, not when you release it.
Well,
when it gets pushed, kaboom.
I have a problem with an episode of MASH then.
There's tons of those, right? So my point is, don't wait till you step on the landmine to start dealing with it.
Deal with it beforehand.
Avoid the landmines. Think about the landmines. Identify the landmines.
Absolutely. And that's why systematic theology is so important. Right. It's also why we can't cover the topic completely here in these 20 minutes. But we are kind of loosely using Wayne Grudem's 20 Basics Every Christian Should Know, Christian Beliefs, as kind of our guiding point as far as what the topics are.
You have the older version. I have the newer version. It's what, 170-something pages or so.
Yeah, I'm at like 160 in mine.
160 to the appendix. Yeah, it's easily accessible to at least get you started.
It's a great starting point. Yeah.
Yep. Get started. And then you can always move from there. I heard of some young men. They're really excited. They got Wayne Grudem's big systematic theology book. My son is going through Christian Doctrine, the middle book between the two. So there's varying levels. And then you can graduate from that into...
And so many other resources, video lectures by R.C. Sproul.
R.C. Sproul. There's so many resources out there. Just want to encourage you, start plugging into good systematic theology resources. And also, let's just give a shout out for good biblical resources. Absolutely. We're not talking about landmines and biblical theology, but that helps as well.
So if you have any thoughts on the landmines of theology when it comes to man and sin, send us an email at SaltyBeliever@gmail.com. And when you sit down to dinner today, you can tell your wife that you learned the word harmonology today.
No, harmatology.
Harmatology. I'm still learning mine.
What'd you call it? Harmonology?
It's not important. Until next time.
Thank you for listening. Find more information at SaltyBeliever.com.